So I just made this awesome outro section and you're not allowed to see it. Well, at least not yet. First, welcome. Second, the snippet you just saw is actually the perfect segue to the topic of today's video and the central idea of this video series called Can We Make It Work, where we take something odd, alone, or otherwise unfinished and see if in the context of a beat or a song we can make it work, and how. This is episode 1, let's get into it. So what you saw at the beginning of the video in my FL Studio is the outro that we're going to be working with today. But before we can get into the meat of this video, I'm going to quickly show you how I made it so that we're on the same page and we can proceed. First was the chords. So the funny thing about this beat and the chords that are in this beat is that I screwed up, which means that between the outro and the rest of the beat, the chord progressions are actually different. And as you'll notice, there's actually a lot of instruments playing a lot of different chord patterns. And it actually sounds really interesting because of it. I'll get into that more as we get through this video, but the next thing I added were the drums. So the next two sounds I added in were the bass and the drone, and they both occupy that kind of low frequency range where the bass gets the lower half and the drone gets the upper half. They're both playing complementary bass lines and the drones also doubles as a counter melody. Let's put those in. So now that brings us to the last three elements of this outro, which are the violins, the lead, and the lead double. The lead double is the same thing as the lead, except it comes in a little bit later and it's down 2 octaves. I'm not really going to explain any of them because they're just melodies and they're kind of long. But if you want, here are the screenshots. Pause the video, do your thing. Now either way, let's move on to the beat. So the first element of this beat are the chords, and in this case they're being played by some violins. Let's put those in. The next thing I put in were the drums, and they do change a little bit going through the flow of the song, but the groove of what's going on stays the same. These are from the verse. Let's put those in. So now that brings us to the bass. And the bass is the same as in the outro, though I didn't mention that the bass is actually 2 sounds layered on top of each other. The top part of that bass sound is from the synth Sakura, and the bottom half is a distorted sine wave. In this beat also, there's 2 different patterns playing in the bass. The first is one you heard in the outro, and the second one you didn't. It's a different pattern, and it sounds like this. So next what we're going to put in are 4 instruments that are all playing chords, and as I said, they're all a little bit different. The first of those 4 sounds is an overdriven guitar, and it's the sound that you didn't hear in the outro, and this is what that sounds like. So now that brings us to number 2 of 4, which is the piano pad, and it's a sound you didn't hear before, so let's put that in. So now that brings us to 3 of 4, which is the guitar, and it's the same guitar that you heard in the outro. Throughout this entire track, the guitar has 2 different patterns at play. The first is the one you heard in the outro, and you'll also hear it in the beat, but it also has a second pattern that appears one time at the end of the first chorus, so let's put that one in. So now that brings us to the last of these sounds, and that's the creeper drone. It's the same pattern as in the outro, so let's put that in. So now that brings us to the accordion, and I kind of lied a little bit, sort of. It's also playing chords, but it's not playing really fast chord stabs like the other 4 instruments were. It's more doubling the violins, and you'll see what I mean when I play it, so let's play it. So now that brings us to the drone, and the drone is playing a different pattern than it was in the outro, and it only comes in during the second chorus slash like build up to the outro. It's super minimal, but it's a big part of the reason why that second chorus slash build up gains as much energy as it does, and this is what that sounds like. So now that brings us to the lead sound of this beat. It's the same lead sound as in the outro, and it only comes in during the hooks. This is what that sounds like. Okay, so now I've shown you every part that comes together to make this beat. So what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to play 8 bars of the chorus so you get an idea of what's going on and how it all works together. This is what that sounds like. So now that brings us into the meat of this video, and that means going back to the beginning. The question was, can we make this work, and how? This is how we're going to do this. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to play a couple bars of that outro again just to give you a quick refresher on what's going on. As you listen to it, pay special attention to the differences that you hear between the outro and the beat itself, because those are the things we're going to have to address if we want to bring this back together. Let's get into it. In this case, the way to make it work is to make a good transition. And in a sentence, what a transition is finding the common thread between two sections and drawing them out so that they become one. And so for me, what I go about doing when I want to make a transition, I look for 3 different things: intensity, emotion, and vibe. Let's start with intensity. Intensity comes down to how strong something is, which in a lot of cases just equals volume. So in this case, what it is that the outro is pretty loud and the beat never really gets all that loud at all. So what I had to do was I had to make everything louder. And as you can see, there's a bunch of different parts that have a bunch of different volume automations on them. So as it moves through that second chorus slash build up to the outro, everything's getting louder and bigger so that once it gets to that outro, suddenly the difference in volume has been bridged. So that brings us to number 2, and number 2 is the emotion. In this case, there were 2 things that needed to be done so that the emotion could be bridged. The first is real simple. What I did was I took some of the patterns of the instruments playing chords in the outro and I moved them to the beat, and kept them consistent through the beat and had them be the same pattern as it gets into and moves through the outro. That way the outro is not completely different from the beat. There's some common things that you can hold on to and already be used to as it switches to this unfamiliar sound. The second thing I did was at that exact line where it switches from beat to outro, I added 4 effects to help smooth out that transition a little bit. They're really quiet and subtle in the back of the beat to the point where you don't hear them, but they work. It takes the beat from this to this. Now the third thing I did has to do with the drone. Now to me the drone goes the farthest way in defining what the outro is. You could say the melody for obvious reasons, but the melody could have been changed and the outro could have largely still been similar, which is why I chose the drone, because if you change the drone, the whole feeling of that outro would have been different. If you consider that the drone pattern in the outro is pretty different from the drone pattern in the beat, and double especially if you consider that there almost is no drone pattern at all through most of the beat itself. I had to make sure that I paid attention to the drone. How I did this involves some music theory, but I will explain it in such a way that even if you don't have any understanding of music theory, you can understand what's going on. The violins are playing chords, and as it moves through that pattern, it's constantly looping back to the beginning. So as a listener, you become used to hearing that, and you have a certain expectation that it's going to keep playing that way. So when you change something, you don't want to change it so much so quickly that it's suddenly like, whoa, what just happened? So the drone line right as the outro starts is playing a C, but the violin part in the beat, the first chord starts with an F. So what I did was I took the beginning of that C in the drone, in the transition, and I lopped it off and I made it an F. That way when it gets into the outro, suddenly everything is still as you expect it. The only other thing I did then is I took that F and at a certain point I brought it back down to a C. But I did that at a point rhythmically where it could be done as invisibly as possible, because the C is what gave the bass line the feeling that it had, but the F is what it needed to go through that transition. So now that brings us to the third thing we needed to connect, which is the vibe. The first thing I did was this. I went to the outro and I looked into it and asked myself the question, what is the main part in the outro that is lending it its vibe, that gives it the most emotional weight? And in this case, that's the chords. When those chords play in the outro, it has a real strong emotional feeling to it. But the problem is that it didn't have that in the chorus or the rest of the beat, so that when it got through that transition into the outro, suddenly out of nowhere, those chords and that real strong emotional sound would just pop up. What I did to fix that was I took those chords and copy and pasted more patterns over backwards in through the last hook so that it comes in before the last hook even starts. I put a real strong volume automation on it so that when it starts, you don't hear it, and by the time it gets through to the end of the chorus, it's just as loud as the chords are at the beginning of the outro. There's two ways of looking at what I did. The first is to say that I just took the chords and started them off quietly and made them louder. The second way of looking at it, which helps you to better see what's actually going on here, is I changed the volume of the chords relative to the other things going on so that they're there in a stronger proportion. The sounds that are the loudest are going to be the ones that have the strongest effect on the music at that point in time. But at the same time, if you suddenly throw a sound in there that is really strong and it comes out of nowhere, it'll be way too jarring for anyone listening to it for it to make any sense at all. That's why I started it off much earlier in the beat at a very low volume so it could move into filling that role. The second thing I did to control the vibe in the transition was I used the piano pads in a very specific way. The piano pads have a very strong emotional sound, and as you'll also probably remember, the outro has a much darker emotion to it than the beat itself. The beat is much happier and brighter. As the second chorus is playing and the song moves through that second chorus, something that has a much darker tone to it has already been introduced into the music before you get to the section that really has a darker tone to it. Right? It takes you from something happy or bright to something more in the middle to something dark, as opposed to going from something very bright to something very dark immediately. So now basically the only thing left to do is to play you this whole beat, which means it's my time to... But before I go, I'd like to say thank you for watching. If you felt like you got something out of this video or felt like it helped you learn something, please throw it a like. I know everybody says that, but it really does help the channel out a lot. Beyond that, if you like these videos and want more of them in the future, come join us on this journey through music. That's it. My name is Guenther. Have a nice day, and remember, if you want to make music better, better make music. Now without further ado, the whole beat.